Here we go. We're now getting into chapter 18, which is focused on eukaryotic diversity. By the end of this chapter, you will have a little bit more practice with phylogenetic trees, as well as know the characteristics of various types of eukaryotes, which include plants, fungi, animals, and protists, and understand what factors contribute to eukaryotic diversity. So we've gone over the other two domains, which are archaea and bacteria. So now we're on to the third, eukaryotes, which is probably the one that we're all most familiar with just because eukaryotes grow much larger and we see them more in our daily lives. So your chapter here on chapter 18 focuses pretty heavily on the Amazon and essentially attempts to save it. So it starts by talking about a lot of the rubber trees that exist in the Amazon, and they essentially have been pretty affected by deforestation and a few other things. So they are essentially trying to get rubber, or let's say Brazil's market for rubber, back on the market, because a long time ago, essentially, once rubber was discovered for how useful it was, they actually took a bunch of rubber trees or seeds from the Amazon and took them over to Asia, and they're actually very successful in Asia. So they started getting many trees in Asia, and you can actually plant a lot more, which we'll get into a little bit later. So because of this, Brazil wasn't really able to capitalize on these rubber trees as much anymore. So in an effort to sort of bring that back, they had this company, Acre. They have a condom factory, and it's one of the efforts that the local government has kind of put in to try to create a market for the sustainably derived forest products from rubber, right? And we know latex and rubber are both very useful to us in many different applications, but during the 2016 Summer Olympics, they heavily marketed this by giving away 9 million condoms throughout Rio, and focusing pretty heavily on this being a sustainable product from the Amazon itself. Can rubber save the rainforest? So again, this kind of goes into a lot of the issues that the Amazon is facing in general, which includes a lot of deforestation. And deforestation is essentially exactly what it sounds like, right? Is that you're deforesting the area, you're cutting and burning, or slashing and burning is what it's referred to quite often. And a lot of times it's so that you can get the products that are coming from the plants that you are deforesting, but often it is also for cattle grazing, because you obviously need lots and lots of land for cattle grazing. So what they'll do is they'll slash and burn or cut down all the trees so that the cattle have more room to graze. And the Amazon actually has quite a bit of biodiversity. And biodiversity just means that there's lots and lots of different species, and their relative abundance in a specific region or on the planet as a whole. So the Amazon has quite a few species, and a lot of them are only found in the Amazon. So if they go extinct in the Amazon, they are extinct from the planet, which is a huge problem. And the Amazon has really the highest levels of biodiversity seen on this planet. So it is very, very important, and it provides quite a few things for the planet as well. You'll often hear the Amazon referred to as the lungs of the planet, which isn't totally true, because the amount of oxygen that the Amazon gives off is actually quite a bit less than the oxygen that we get from the ocean, but it still has a great deal to do with regulating the climate, and it still does release quite a bit of oxygen from all the trees that are there, as well as storing the carbon in these trees through the process of photosynthesis. And again, quite a bit of species biodiversity, which means that we would lose quite a few species if we keep losing as much of the Amazon as we are right now to deforestation and other things, but deforestation is one of the greatest. And you can see here the top 20 countries that deforested the most forest. Brazil is at the very top by quite a significant difference, and followed about half as much by Indonesia. And you can see other countries on there as well, but the bulk of the Amazon is in Brazil, so that's really quite a problem for this. And the Amazon is also home to lots of different kinds of plants that are basically commercially available consumer products for us. So lots of different pharmaceuticals, food products, as well as latex and different rubber products too. So when we're talking about eukaryotes, they have quite a bit of diversity as well, though not as much as bacteria and archaea. But again, these are the ones that we normally think of. So within eukarya, we have basically 4 different kinds of eukaryotes that we're talking about. So we have protists, which are mostly single-celled. So don't let that trip you up. These guys are single-celled, but that doesn't mean that they fall into bacteria archaea. They are still eukaryotes. And remember, the biggest thing that separates eukaryotes and prokaryotes is right up here, is that they have these membrane-bound or membrane-enclosed organelles, which means that they also have a nucleus. So they can be single-celled or multicellular. Most of them are multicellular, but our protists are single-celled. Fungi can also be single-celled. Okay. So protists and fungi, and then we also have plants, as well as probably the most known, at least by us, which are animals. Okay, and each one of these has certain characteristics that kind of go into defining which group it really belongs to. The first one we'll talk about are plants. So plants are a multicellular eukaryote. They do have cell walls. Remember, those are made of cellulose, so they are a little bit different than our bacterial cell walls. They are photosynthetic, and they are well adapted to life on land. So again, their cell structure has a lot to do with why they are adapted to life on land, which we'll talk about in just a second. And many of them have pretty good defense systems that kind of keep them away from herbivory or keep them away from other animals eating them, like waxy leaves, or some of them produce chemicals that can also kill or deter pests just naturally. And reproduction, they've got some different ways of reproducing depending on what kind of plants we're talking about. But they are pretty interesting because they do rely on water, wind, or animals to bring those gametes together, right? Plants aren't mobile, so they can't necessarily walk around or move around really in any way to be able to reproduce or position themselves against predation. So they have to really rely on these defenses and on different forms of reproduction that kind of bring them together. So of the plants, we have a few different varieties. So we have non-vascular versus vascular. And then we also have different reproduction styles. So we have sperm that can only survive in water, as well as pollen and seeds that resist drying. So non-vascular versus vascular. Non-vascular means that essentially they're in water, right? So these are like mosses, and they can only be in moist environments because they don't have this vascular tissue. So they're able to absorb water and nutrients into their cells just like a sponge. So they get it directly from their immediate environment, which is why they're pretty much at ground level, and they're essentially soaked in water to begin with, which is how they're getting the water. Versus our vascular guys here, so like the rubber trees, those are vascular. And the way they do it is they have these basically little vascular tubes, and these structures, which kind of look like veins, right? They allow that plant to move water and nutrients throughout the plant. So they can take up water and nutrients at the roots that can penetrate pretty deep into the soil and then transport all of those water and nutrients throughout the whole body of the plant, basically delivering food to where the plant needs it most. Okay, you can see a little cross section of a vascular system or a vascular stem here, and kind of how they're arranged in these little tubes and how they transport water throughout the plant. And then we have a few different modes of reproduction as well. So like our non-vascular plants, these guys pretty much have the sperm that can only survive in water. So they're swimming sperm, and basically they've got to move through the water to reach the female reproductive structures. So you see this with like moss sperm most of the time. Okay. We also have pollen and seeds, and usually they're pretty resistant to drying, and they've got a thick or waxy covering, and that's just because the male gametes of these are in pollen or possibly in seeds, and they have to be transported in air. So they've got to be able to protect themselves from drying up and dying, essentially. Okay, so talking about plants here, our very first plants were the bryophytes. So these were our earliest plants. They are non-vascular. Okay, so they don't have roots and tissue for transporting water and nutrients, which means that they're pretty much on the ground. They're essentially in really damp environments, and they do not produce seeds. So these guys rely on fertilization and water. They've got to have those swimming sperm, and if the sperm leave the water, they are no longer fertile, essentially. So they've got to be able to fertilize female gametes within the female reproductive structures, but again, it's got to be within the water. So the water diffuses directly into and out of the cells of these kind of plants, and again, they're usually pretty low to the ground, if not on the actual ground. So bryophytes, earliest plants, no seeds, no vascular tissue. Next up, we start getting into our vascular plants. So again, these have the specialized tissues for transport, and these are our ferns, our angiosperms, and our gymnosperms. Okay, so the very first vascular plant that we started seeing here on Earth were the ferns. And these guys, again, had the vascular system to be able to transport water, so they could draw water from the soil, and they could actually grow pretty tall and rigid because of this. These guys still do not have seeds, okay? And they are pretty tall and strong, essentially, but they do still have the fertilization and water. So these male gametes have to swim in external moisture to fertilize the female gametes within the female reproductive structures. So still kind of resistant to drying and can't be carried by wind or pollen or anything like that. Again, there's no seeds, has to happen in water. But these are our very first vascular plants that start to show up on Earth. Okay, up next we have gymnosperms, and then we'll go into the angiosperms. But gymnosperms, gymnos is Greek for naked. So these are essentially our naked seeds, which means that they're typically held in cones. And again, they're vascularized, so they can grow up pretty tall and strong and be able to transport nutrients and water throughout the plant, again, drawing it from the soil. But these guys, the male gametes, are actually in pollen, and they're distributed to female structures by wind. So these guys are relying pretty heavily on wind, and they produce seeds that develop usually in cones, like I said. So they have the ripened seeds within these cones, and they get carried off by wind to different parts of, or different areas, essentially, and are able to fertilize females as well. Okay, last but not least, we have our angiosperms showing up. So our angiosperms are also seed plants, but these guys have seeds and fruit. So these are our flowering plants. So angio basically means a vessel or container. These guys came around about 360 million years ago, and they represent over 90% of all the plants today. So most of the plants you see today are referred to as angiosperms. These are our seed plants and the ones that have flowering fruits, essentially. So again, they are vascularized, so they can grow up tall and strong, and they do flower as well as produce seeds in their fruit. So these ones are not fertilized in water, just like the gymnosperms. These guys are pollinated either by animal, or they could be by wind as well, technically. But these seeds develop in the fruit, and then they can be carried off by wind, or they can be pollinated by animals like bees, hummingbirds, that sort of thing. Okay, so if we're looking at a phylogenetic tree, we've got a common ancestor that occurred about 450 million years ago. And again, the very first plants that we're seeing are these bryophytes. Okay, so there are no seeds, no vascular tissue. That's like our moss that's just growing near to the ground. And then you can see we've got a node here. This node is for vascular tissue. So everything above this, so ferns, gymnosperms, and angiosperms all have vascular tissue. Okay, and then we get to our very first vascularized plant, which are our ferns. Again, still don't have seeds, still fertilized just in water. And then we get to our next node, which is pollen and seeds. So the only two that have pollen and seeds here are gymnosperms and angiosperms. And again, angiosperms are the ones that make up about 90% of the plants that we see today that have mostly fruit in them as well. And you can see that that's our last node here, which only applies to our angiosperms. So again, get some good practice reading these phylogenetic trees, but that's essentially what we're looking at, is we're looking at the evolution of these plants over time. And the one closest to our common ancestor is our bryophyte, and the one furthest away are our angiosperms, which are the ones that we see mostly today. So you can kind of follow the evolution of plants and what developed over time. So the very first thing we were developing after our bryophytes was the vascularized tissue. So we started seeing taller plants that were able to survive off the ground essentially. And that's when they kind of start out competing one another for resources like sunlight, right? So if they're not getting sunlight because they're so covered in a canopy, then they're not going to do as well in a really dense forest. Okay, so that was the plants. Up next we have our fungi. So it's fungus, or plural is fungi. And these guys, again, can be unicellular or multicellular. It doesn't really matter. Either way, they're still eukaryotes. But they can be unicellular or multicellular. And the way that they obtain their nutrients is by secreting digestive enzymes into the organic matter and then reabsorbing it. So it's kind of this continuous loop down here. So you can see that they basically secrete these digestive enzymes, and it goes into the food source or the soil, and then they redigest them through the absorbed. These things are called hyphae or hyphae. Okay, and these are basically throughout the fungal body, and that's the way that they actually get their nutrition. So that's the way that they reach their food sources, and they basically are decomposers. So they're feeding on other organisms by secreting these enzymes. So they digest and use these organic molecules within the dead organisms as sources of nutrients and energy. So our fungi, no matter whether they're unicellular or multicellular, are our decomposers. So you can see that they also have cell walls, and their cell walls are made of something called chitin, which is actually a pretty strong cell wall. And the way that these guys reproduce is by spores. So these spores are pretty resistant to drying, and they release into the air. So mushrooms store spores in the gills, and then they get released by wind or some other physical disruption. Okay, and as a defense, because these guys can't move around to avoid predation, right? A lot of times they're beneath the surface, so you can't even see them, which allows them to kind of be avoided. But a lot of other fungi also produce toxins that deter predators. And over time, this is kind of a learned behavior that they deter predators, or sometimes they give off a certain color or something like that in nature in general. But you've probably been told not to eat random mushrooms that you see growing in places. And part of the reason is because some of them are toxic. Okay. So again, they have these thread-like structures called hyphae. Singular is hypha, right? And it's just a chain of a lot of cells that's capable of absorbing these nutrients. So it's like this really complex web within the fungus that essentially takes back all those nutrients that came from some decomposing organism, okay? And they interweave together to form this mycelium. All of that is just part of the fungus. That's essentially just how they're obtaining their nutrients. And within fungi, we've got a few different kinds. So we've got yeast here. So yeast are kind of interesting because they have both sexual and asexual reproduction. And you know about yeast for a lot of different reasons probably, but these guys are actually our fungi that are single-celled. So I think it's actually really the only fungi that are single-celled for the most part. So remember that. The rest of fungi is usually multicellular, but these guys are single-celled, which means that they're unicellular essentially, right? And they're used for a lot of different things. So we use them in the food industry, obviously. We use them for a lot of different things, including alcohol or bread, things like that. They're also used in biotechnology. So you'll see them kind of all over the place, as well as the beverage industry, which I kind of already alluded to, but you know that's one of the main things responsible for, let's say, beer. So these guys are kind of interesting because they still release digestive enzymes onto the food source and then reabsorb those nutrients. And again, they're the ones really contributing to a lot of fermented sugars, and they live symbiotically with plants and animals usually. Humans even have yeast as well, just depending on what part of the body you're looking at. Okay, we also have our molds. Molds are multicellular as well as mushrooms. Mushrooms are probably the most common fungi that we really think about, but there are all three of these. And both of them are multicellular. They both have the same hyphae that form the mycelia within the food source, so that kind of network that's being created and releasing digestive enzymes as well as reabsorbing them. And they can essentially decompose themselves, right? So they decay into leaf litter and dead organisms, and then they reabsorb essentially. And for molds, they have both sexual and asexual reproduction as well, and they can also release spores that germinate to form new mycelia. So basically new little networks of hyphae, okay? Our mushrooms, as you might have guessed, have these fruiting bodies that emerge from the mycelia, and those release sexual spores that then germinate to form new mycelia, and then we get new mushrooms forming from them. When we're talking about plant and fungal diversity or biodiversity, especially within the Amazon, one of the reasons that we think we have such high diversity within the rainforest is because of pests. So this is referred to as the Jansen-Connell hypothesis, and essentially you have host-specific pests, which means that fungi, insects, and microbes keep new plants of the same species from growing near a parent plant. So essentially you have pests that only affect one species of plant and not the other species around that, right? So if you have these pests that are feeding on a specific tree, right, parent plant, and then the seeds and seedlings are most abundant, you can't have other trees right next to it. So essentially what happens is these guys usually have some sort of seed that can be carried really, really far. Some of them burst and they essentially like shoot out hundreds of feet. Some of them are carried kind of randomly and by luck, by wind, depending on what it is. But essentially, the way that you get more biodiversity is by developing different reproductive methods like this that keep them spaced out far apart. So even if this tree over here gets a lot of pests near it, it's not going to affect the successful offspring because they have other trees in between that are not affected by these pests, right? So all of these are unsuccessful offspring because they may be seeded or sprouted a little bit too close to the parent tree that had the pests, and so they were also infected. But the one, like the pod that explodes and goes 100 feet away or 100 yards away, let's say, will be successful because those pests can't get that far and they're encountering other species that aren't affected by them. So this is one of the things that really drives rainforest diversity. And it's interesting because this is part of the problem with the rubber industry in the Amazon, because when they took these trees to Asia, Asia doesn't have the same pests that the Amazon does. So these trees can be planted like right next to each other in Asia, whereas in the Amazon, they've got to be spaced out like this because they do have the pests. So you can't have quite as many rubber trees there, which is part of the reason that in Asia, we've got a pretty booming rubber tree industry, I guess. Okay, so last but not least, we're finally getting into the animals. So these are the ones that you probably hear the most about and honestly probably think the most about when you think of eukarya as a domain in general. At least I do, because these are the ones that we really, for the most part, see, right? We see plants and stuff too, but there's very few people who get super excited about plants, although you should, because they are really cool and they are what are feeding you and driving our planet. But anyways, animals are the exciting ones. So these guys are still multicellular and they are still eukaryotic, but these are heterotrophs, right? So they don't create their own energy. They've got to obtain nutrients by ingesting other animals. So they do have a cell structure very similar to other eukaryotes, but they don't have cell walls like our plants and fungi do, okay? And again, they're heterotrophs, so they've got to obtain their nutrients from eating other food. And unlike plants and fungi, they're mobile. They can move around. So they rely on the speed, and some of them are slower, right? But they rely on speed to be able to outrun or outswim predators. And for the slower ones, they usually develop or adapt to some different way of deterring predators. So it might be poison or it might be spiny coverings to offer protection. Whatever it is, they still have some mechanism of defense and they're still relatively mobile, as well as reproduction. So plants and fungi, they can't really move around, right? So they're relying on different animals to pollinate, or they're relying on wind or water. With animals, they actually can move around and they reproduce sexually. So they can actually go in search of specific mates, and a lot of times they have different mating strategies to be able to be a little bit more reproductively successful. When we're talking about animals, we have 3 different main lineages, and these are basically referring to 3 distinct body plans, okay? So our first one is no definite shape. So we call these guys asymmetrical. And these are kind of like sponges or sometimes corals. And sponges are very similar to the earliest animals to have populated the ocean. So again, they don't really have any defined shape. And they're usually not very mobile, if really mobile at all. So they're kind of relying on food that's floating by. So this kind of food for sponges and corals is really carried by currents for the most part. But they do have physical protective mechanisms. Some of them are covered with things that really can hurt other predators, or they could produce toxins as well. The next body plan that we have is radial symmetry. So radial symmetry just means that they're symmetrical in all directions. So they have no distinct right or left side, and this refers mostly to cnidarians like jellyfish. Okay, so they usually don't move much on their adult life. Like jellyfish can propel themselves really short distances, but they can't necessarily go super far. So again, they're still kind of relying on currents to carry them around. And then last to evolve, we have our bilateral symmetry. So this is probably most of the animals that you think of. And this is essentially they have two sides, right? And it's a mirror image, the left and the right side. They might not necessarily be perfectly symmetrical, but they still have this bilateral symmetry. And this enables them to have a really purposeful, directed movement to be able to find food and mates, as well as to avoid any type of danger like predation. Again, another phylogenetic tree. I know this is your guys' favorite, I'm sure. So again, we start with our common ancestor, right? So our common ancestor occurred about 800 million years ago, which is crazy to think, but still not technically that long ago. So we first started off with asymmetry. So we first started off with things like sponges, okay? Again, no real organized tissues, no symmetry. And then we went to radial symmetry. Okay, and with radial symmetry, again, we're talking mostly about things like jellyfish. They're still in aquatic and marine habitats. They still can't really propel themselves, but they do have radial symmetry, and they can propel themselves a little bit, but for the most part, they're still relying on currents. And last to evolve now, we've got bilateral symmetry. So here's our node, let's say like really right here for bilateral symmetry, and everything that follows after that falls within the bilateral symmetry category. So we've got invertebrates, which make up the bulk of it, and then vertebrates. So remember, vertebrates are the ones that have a backbone, okay? And we'll go into these in just a second too, but we've got flatworms, mollusks, annelids, nematodes, arthropods, and echinoderms. So echinoderms are like our sea cucumber or sea urchins, vana. They have an endoskeleton, a lot of times have a really leathery outer skin, and some of these we'll talk about a little bit more in general. So we have flatworms, mollusks, annelids, nematodes, and arthropods as well. And then we'll get into vertebrates, which are chordates, which just means essentially that they have a backbone and a spinal cord. So chordates refers more to spinal cord. Okay. So again, radial symmetry, body plan that's circular, no clear left or right. And then bilateral symmetry, we've got mirror images of each other. So they're better adapted for seeking food, stalking prey, and avoiding predators. So most of the animals that you probably think of today are under bilateral symmetry and are more recently evolved. Okay, so within the bilateral symmetry category, about 95% of these animals are invertebrates. So these are the ones that don't have a backbone. These are a lot of the little guys, essentially. And then the bigger ones that we see more often, they're not always necessarily big, are our vertebrates. And that only makes up about 5% of this category. Okay. So within our invertebrates, we'll talk first about mollusks. So these guys are soft-bodied invertebrates. So they generally do have a hard shell, but the body is soft. So these are things like slugs, snails, clams. And these guys are pretty cool because they digest dead plant material and then they help recycle those nutrients. So they're pretty cool because they're like little recyclers as well, kind of like the fungi are for us. And then we also have annelids. So these are things like earthworms. They have a long segmented body. And they're pretty cool and they're pretty useful to us as well because they actually create passageways in the soil. And these passageways basically allow soil and, water and air to be able to move through the soil and help some of these plants grow a little bit better as well. Up next, we have arthropods. You guys have probably heard of arthropods, and might do a lab next week based on an arthropod that you probably know pretty well, the ants. And these are our most abundant invertebrates. So these guys have a segmented body, usually in 3 different segments. And they've been around for quite a while. And there's only about 850 to 900,000 of them described, but they think there's probably closer to 2 to 4 million species of these guys alone, which is pretty crazy. So these guys have jointed appendages. They also have a hard exoskeleton. So this is what protects them from predators and keeps them from drying out, as well as provides some structure and support for movement. So for the most part, these are the insects that we usually think about are our arthropods. So that's why we have so many of them. They're probably, well, they are the most abundant kind of invertebrates and probably the one you think of most as well. Okay, so with vertebrates here, and remember with inverts, we also have those echinoderms, which are like the sea urchins that we talked about. So now moving on to vertebrates, these are the ones that we normally think of, I think, when you're thinking of animals, but these are the ones that have a backbone and a spinal cord. So spinal cord means that they're a chordate, okay? So this is fish, birds, reptiles, amphibians, and mammals, which is what we fall into as well, okay? Okay, so that's our plants, animals, and fungi. So the very last classification that we're missing under eukaryotes is protists. Protists are really kind of weird, and they're really hard to classify. So it's basically any eukaryote that can't be classified as a plant, animal, or fungus. And again, these guys are kind of strange. They're usually unicellular, which doesn't apply to most eukaryotes, but again, does apply to some. And some are heterotrophic, while some can still be autotrophic. Okay, so these are things like algae, right? Algae is just a diverse collection of aquatic photosynthetic organisms, which have both unicellular and multicellular species. So these guys are interesting, protists, because they are unicellular. So that means that they're not animals, even though they might have some characteristics that are similar to animals. And you also have multicellular algae that can photosynthesize like plants, but they can't live on land. They don't have any roots or stems or leaves, so this is what makes it so they can't classify them as plants. And they do have some fungi-like characteristics as well, but they're not fungi. And again, they can't live on land, so that kind of eliminates them from these. So they are really hard to classify, and they do share features with each of these groups, but they aren't quite fitting into any of them. So that's where we identify protists, and protists are probably the most difficult to identify.